Nelson. It was a small act, almost casual, but symbolic of a larger truth. African identity was being reshaped to fit a colonial world. Mandela did not choose this name, yet he carried it forward, eventually turning it into a symbol of resistance and hope. As a boy, Mandela lived a life of cattle herding, traditional ceremonies, and simple joys. But beneath the calm rhythms of village life, questions were forming. Why were some people free to move, speak, and vote, while others were not? Why did the law protect some and punish others? He did not yet have answers, but the sky above him was changing. The wind carried whispers of injustice, and the quiet child from Veso was beginning to understand that his life would be shaped by forces far greater than himself. This was not yet the story of a revolutionary. It was the beginning of a journey, of a boy born under apartheid skies, destined to challenge them. As the sun rose each morning over the rolling hills of the Eastern Cape, young Nelson Mandela began to understand that the world was shaped not only by tradition, but by power. Living at the Great Place, under the care of Chief Jongintaba Dalindyebo, Mandela was surrounded by ceremony and structure. This was a place where leadership was visible, where elders spoke with authority, and where decisions affected thousands of lives. Yet what impressed the young boy most was not command, it was listening. He watched the chief sit in council meetings that sometimes lasted for hours. Every man was allowed to speak. Even those who disagreed were heard with patience. Only after everyone had spoken would the chief rise to summarize the discussion and guide a decision. Mandela would later say that this taught him the most important lesson of leadership. A leader is not above the people, but among them. At school, Mandela proved to be a disciplined and capable student. Education opened doors that village life alone could not. He learned English, mathematics, history, and scripture. But alongside these lessons came something more unsettling, a clearer view of racial inequality. In classrooms, textbooks spoke of British kings and European explorers as heroes. African history was ignored, treated as if it had never existed. Mandela felt a quiet confusion. He knew his people had rich traditions, leaders, and laws, so why were they invisible on the page? Outside school, the reality was harsher. Mandela saw black South Africans forced to bow, step aside, or lower their eyes in the presence of whites. He heard stories of land taken, families broken apart, and men humiliated by laws they had no voice in creating. These moments planted a deep, silent anger inside him, not explosive, but steady. As he grew older, expectations closed in around him. According to tradition, Mandela was being prepared for a future as a counselor to the Tembu royal house. His life seemed already planned: respect, responsibility, and service within the system. Yet something inside him resisted a future that required silence in the face of injustice. At the age of 16, Mandela underwent the Xhosa initiation ceremony, marking his transition into manhood. The ritual was ancient, sacred, and serious. But during the ceremony, one speech struck him deeply. The speaker spoke of freedom, yet also admitted that their people were not truly free, that they lived on land ruled by others, that their manhood was symbolic, not real. For Mandela, this was a turning point. He realized that dignity without freedom was hollow, tradition without justice was incomplete, and manhood, if it meant obedience to oppression, was not enough. The boy who once listened quietly was beginning to hear a call, not from a single voice, but from the pain of his people. Still, he was not yet a rebel. He admired British culture.
He respected order and discipline. He believed, at this stage, that the system could be fixed, that fairness could be achieved without conflict. His anger had not yet found direction, but questions followed him like shadows. Why were laws written by those who did not represent the majority? Why were opportunities limited by skin color? Why was obedience demanded, but respect denied? As Mandela prepared to leave the great place for further education, he stood at the edge of two worlds, one of tradition and authority, and another of growing awareness and doubt. The freedom he heard calling was still distant, still unclear, still unnamed. But once heard, it could not be unheard. And the boy who listened so carefully was slowly becoming a man who would one day speak.
When Nelson Mandela left the familiar hills of the Eastern Cape, he carried more than books and belongings with him. He carried questions. The journey from the great place to the city marked a quiet but profound shift. For the first time, Mandela stepped beyond the rhythms of traditional life into a world shaped by modern power, laws, and visible inequality. The village had taught him who he was. The city would teach him how the world worked. Mandela enrolled at Fort Hare University, the only higher education institution for Black South Africans at the time. To many, Fort Hare was a place of privilege and opportunity. To Mandela, it was something more dangerous. It was a place where ideas moved freely. Students came from across the continent, carrying different perspectives, ambitions, and frustrations. Conversations stretched late into the night about identity, colonialism, leadership, and the future of Africa. For the first time, Mandela realized that his questions were shared by many others. Yet Fort Hare was not a place of total freedom. The university operated under strict rules shaped by colonial authority. Students were expected to obey, not challenge. When a student protest erupted over unfair policies and lack of representation, Mandela was faced with a choice: remain silent and secure his future, or stand with those demanding dignity. He chose conscience. Mandela refused to participate in a student council election he believed was unjust. The response was swift. He was expelled. This moment could have broken him. Instead, it clarified him. Returning home, Mandela was met not with comfort, but with expectation. The regent, Chief Jungintaba, had arranged a marriage for him, believing tradition would steady his path. To Mandela, it felt like a final attempt to pull him back into a life already written. He could not accept it. In a decision both fearful and brave, Mandela ran away to Johannesburg with his cousin Justice. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a refusal to live a life chosen by others. Johannesburg was a different universe. The city was loud, crowded, and cruel. Mandela saw wealth and poverty living side by side, divided sharply by race. White workers labored endlessly in mines and factories, while white citizens enjoyed comfort and protection. The law enforced this separation with cold efficiency. Mandela took work as a security guard, then later as a law clerk. He lived in cramped rooms, struggled financially, and faced the daily humiliations of apartheid. Yet the city also gave him something invaluable: exposure. He met men and women who spoke openly about resistance. He was introduced to the African National Congress, though at first only from a distance. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing the language of justice and struggle. At night, after long hours of work, Mandela studied law. Education became his weapon, not against people, but against injustice. He began to believe that understanding the system was the first step to dismantling it. Slowly, the young man from the village was changing. The respect for order he had learned in childhood remained, but it was now paired with a growing refusal to accept unjust authority. His belief in fairness was no longer abstract. It was personal. The city had stripped away illusion. It showed him that freedom would not arrive on its own, that dignity had to be claimed, that silence was a form of surrender. Nelson Mandela was not yet a leader. He had not yet raised his voice, but his mind was awake. And once awakened, it would never sleep again.
Johannesburg did not soften Nelson Mandela. It sharpened him. By day, he worked quietly as a law clerk, observing how rules were written, interpreted, and enforced. By night, he studied relentlessly, determined to master the very system that oppressed his people. The law, he believed, could either be a chain or a key. As Mandela moved through the city, apartheid revealed itself not as an idea, but as a daily cruelty. Pass laws controlled movement. Police raids shattered families. Jobs were reserved, neighborhoods segregated, and justice tilted sharply in one direction. Yet Mandela did not respond with rage. He responded with purpose. Through his work, he began meeting men and women who spoke openly of resistance. Among them were thinkers, organizers, and activists who believed South Africa could be transformed, not through submission, but through unity. Slowly, Mandela moved from listener to participant. In 1944, he formally joined the African National Congress, the ANC. At first, the organization moved cautiously, relying on petitions and appeals to conscience. Mandela respected this approach, but felt it was no longer enough. The system they faced did not listen to polite requests. It responded only to pressure. Alongside young leaders like Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo, Mandela helped form the ANC Youth League. Their goal was clear: to inject urgency, discipline, and mass action into the struggle. This was not rebellion for chaos's sake. It was rebellion guided by belief. Mandela's confidence grew, not loud, not aggressive, but steady. He spoke with clarity, conviction, and calm authority. His words carried weight because they were grounded in lived experience. He was not calling for hatred, he was calling for dignity. In 1952, Mandela and Tambo made history by opening South Africa's first black law firm. For the first time, ordinary black citizens could seek legal help from lawyers who understood their pain. The office was constantly crowded. People arrived with stories of injustice, beatings, evictions, false arrests. Mandela listened to them all, and with each case, his resolve hardened. That same year, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign, a nationwide movement of nonviolent resistance against unjust laws. Mandela emerged as one of its key leaders. He traveled, organized, and inspired, often under surveillance. The government noticed. Arrests followed. Bans were imposed. Mandela was forbidden from speaking publicly or attending gatherings. But silence did not stop him. It only forced him to speak in new ways. He began to understand something deeply unsettling. The law, as it existed, was not neutral. It was designed to protect power, not justice. And still, he believed in restraint. Mandela, at this stage, was disciplined, measured, and committed to peaceful change. He believed violence would corrupt the soul of the struggle. He believed moral authority mattered. But the walls were closing in. In 1956, Mandela and over 100 activists were arrested and charged with treason. The trial dragged on for years. Lives were placed on hold. Families suffered. Futures were uncertain. Yet, even in the courtroom, Mandela stood tall. He was no longer just defending himself, he was defending an idea, that freedom was not a crime. As the trial unfolded, South Africa itself was changing. The apartheid state was becoming more brutal, more rigid,
more afraid, and Mandela could feel it. The law had given him a voice. The struggle had given him direction, and now that voice was rising, calm, controlled, and impossible to ignore. Nelson Mandela was no longer just a man learning the system. He was becoming a man ready to challenge it.
By the mid-1940s, Nelson Mandela understood something with growing clarity. The struggle for freedom could not be fought alone. Johannesburg had shown him the machinery of apartheid. The law had revealed its limits. And now the time had come to choose a side, not quietly, not cautiously, but with commitment. The African National Congress was not new. It had been founded decades earlier, built on patience, petitions, and appeals to justice. To Mandela, it represented dignity and history, but also hesitation. The world had changed, and oppression had grown more aggressive. Polite resistance was no longer enough. In 1944, Mandela formally joined the ANC. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no public announcement, no applause, just a decision made with calm resolve. From that day forward, his life would belong not only to himself, but to a movement. Within the ANC, Mandela found mentors and brothers. Walter Sisulu offered guidance and discipline. Oliver Tambo brought thoughtfulness and compassion. Together, they shared a belief that South Africa needed a new generation of leadership, young, bold, and unafraid. That same year, Mandela married Evelyn Mace and began building a family. Yet even as he tried to balance personal life and public duty, the struggle pressed in from all sides. Activism did not pause for domestic happiness. It demanded sacrifice. The young leaders soon formed the ANC Youth League. Their message was clear. The time for waiting had passed. They called for mass action, strikes, boycotts, and civil disobedience. They believed freedom would not be gifted, it would be demanded. Mandela emerged as a natural leader. He was not the loudest voice in the room. He did not rely on anger or insult. His power lay in discipline, in his ability to listen, to persuade, and to hold firm without hatred. People trusted him because he respected them. As apartheid laws tightened, the ANC began to transform. The Youth League's ideas reshaped the organization's strategy. Mandela helped draft programs that called for full equality, political, economic, and human. This was no longer about reform. It was about liberation. But the cost was rising. Mandela was increasingly watched, followed, and restricted. Police files thickened with his name. His movements were monitored. His future, once filled with promise as a lawyer, grew uncertain. Still, he did not retreat. In meetings held in cramped rooms and whispered conversations late at night, Mandela learned the language of organized resistance. He learned how movements survive pressure, how unity must be protected, how discipline keeps hope alive. Yet even now, Mandela believed in peaceful struggle. He believed the moral high ground mattered, that violence would poison the dream of freedom, that justice achieved through cruelty would never truly be justice. This belief would soon be tested. The apartheid state was growing more ruthless. Laws became harsher, punishments became heavier, and patience on both sides was thinning. Mandela could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. The ANC was no longer just a political organization. It was becoming a force the government feared. And Nelson Mandela, once a quiet boy listening beneath village trees, was now firmly inside the storm of history. He had joined the movement, and there would be no turning back. By the early 1950s, apartheid was no longer tightening its grip quietly. It was striking openly. New laws controlled where people could live, work, and walk. Identity papers were demanded at every corner. Police raids became routine. Fear settled into daily life, not as panic, but as exhaustion. For Nelson Mandela, this was the moment when resistance could no longer remain symbolic. The Defiance Campaign of 1952 marked a turning point. It was carefully planned, disciplined, and peaceful. Thousands of ordinary South Africans were asked to do something radical, not by violence, but by refusal. To walk where they were forbidden, to break laws designed to humiliate them, to accept arrest without hatred. Mandela was one of the campaign's chief organizers. He traveled constantly, speaking to workers, students, and community leaders. His voice carried calm urgency. He did not promise easy victory, he promised meaning. He reminded people that dignity begins when fear ends. Arrests came swiftly. Mandela himself was charged and convicted under the Suppression of Communism Act, a law used broadly to silence any opposition. He was given a suspended prison sentence and placed under severe restrictions. He was banned from attending meetings, banned from leaving certain areas, banned from speaking publicly. The state tried to make him invisible. Instead, it made him stronger. Confined and watched, Mandela adapted. Leadership, he learned, was not about presence, it was about continuity. Messages were passed quietly, plans were made discreetly. The movement learned to breathe under pressure. At the same time, his personal life began to fracture. The strain of constant surveillance, long absences, and danger weighed heavily on his family. His marriage to Evelyn deteriorated. The struggle demanded more than time, it demanded emotional distance. Yet even as his private world narrowed, his public role expanded. In 1955, leaders from across South Africa gathered to draft the Freedom Charter, a document declaring that the country belonged to all who lived in it, regardless of race. Though Mandela was banned and forced to operate from the shadows, his influence shaped the vision. The charter was simple and revolutionary. It called for equality before the law, shared wealth, and human dignity. To the government, it was treason. To the people, it was hope written down. The response was brutal. In 1956, Mandela and over 100 others were arrested and charged with treason. The trial stretched on for years, draining energy and resources, but it also revealed something unexpected. The state was afraid. Despite the pressure, Mandela remained disciplined and composed. He used the courtroom not as a place of defense, but as a stage for moral clarity. The charge was treason, but the crime, he argued, was apartheid itself. As the years passed, the limits of peaceful resistance became harder to ignore. Protests were met with bullets, demonstrations were crushed, entire communities were punished collectively. The system responded to non-violence with violence. Mandela did not abandon his principles lightly. He wrestled with the question that would define his life. What does justice demand when peace is answered with brutality? Defiance had begun as refusal. Now it was becoming something heavier, something darker. And Nelson Mandela stood at the edge of a choice that would change the course of history, not only for himself, but for a nation still waiting to breathe freely.
There are moments in history when silence becomes a form of violence. For Nelson Mandela, that moment arrived not suddenly, but after years of restraint, patience, and hope slowly worn thin. The turning point came in 1960 in the township of Sharpeville. On a quiet morning, thousands of black South Africans gathered peacefully to protest the pass laws, documents that controlled where they could live and move. They carried no weapons, they posed no threat, yet police opened fire.
69 people were killed. The air filled with screams, dust, and disbelief. South Africa crossed a line from which it could not return. For Nelson Mandela, Sharpeville shattered the last illusion that the apartheid state could be persuaded by moral appeal alone. Peaceful protest had been met with bullets. Lawful dissent had been answered with death. The government declared a state of emergency. The African National Congress was banned. Leaders were hunted. Meetings became crimes. Mandela went underground. For the first time, he lived in hiding, moving between safe houses, disguising himself, communicating through trusted channels. The press would later call him the Black Pimpernel. But hiding did not mean surrender. It meant preparation. Mandela now faced the hardest decision of his life. Could a movement dedicated to human dignity justify the use of force? Could violence ever serve justice, or would it poison the dream of freedom? He did not answer lightly. Mandela studied revolutions across the world. He examined failures and successes. He consulted elders, comrades, and his own conscience. And slowly, reluctantly, he reached a conclusion. Nonviolence had been a principle, not a religion. When a government makes peaceful change impossible, Mandela believed, resistance must take another form. In 1961, Mandela helped establish Umkhonto we Sizwe, meaning Spear of the Nation. It would not target civilians, it would focus on sabotage, symbolic attacks against infrastructure designed to disrupt the state without spilling blood. This was not a rejection of morality, it was an act of grim responsibility. Mandela released a statement explaining the decision. He spoke of sorrow, not celebration, of necessity, not anger. He made it clear this path was chosen because all others had been closed. The risks were enormous. Mandela was now not only a dissident, but an enemy of the state. Arrest meant life imprisonment or worse. His family was in constant danger. His freedom narrowed to hours and shadows. Yet even in secrecy, Mandela's discipline remained. He trained quietly. He traveled secretly. In 1962, he left South Africa to seek international support and military training. Across Africa, he met leaders who saw South Africa's struggle as part of a larger fight against colonialism. When he returned home, he was more committed and more vulnerable than ever. Within months, Mandela was captured. There was no dramatic escape, no final speech, just a quiet end to a life lived in motion. But his arrest did not end the struggle, it transformed it. Peace had no longer been enough, and Mandela had crossed a line he knew he might never return from. The cost of that choice was about to be measured in years.
The prison cell was small, silent, and final in its certainty. When Nelson Mandela was arrested in 1962, the apartheid state believed it had captured a man. What it did not yet understand was that it had captured a symbol. At first, the charges were simple: leaving the country illegally and inciting strikes. Mandela was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But the government was not finished. They wanted more than punishment. They wanted erasure. In 1963, police raided a secret hideout at Rivonia, uncovering documents that linked Mandela and his comrades to Umkhonto we Sizwe. The discovery changed everything. Mandela and several others were charged with sabotage, crimes that carried the death penalty. The Rivonia trial began under heavy guard, watched by the world. Inside the courtroom, Mandela stood calm and composed. He wore traditional dress at times, refusing to be reduced to a criminal. He did not deny his actions, he explained them. This was not a trial meant to seek truth. It was meant to end a movement. On April 20th, 1964, Mandela rose to deliver his statement.
He spoke not as a man begging for mercy, but as one explaining history to those who had refused to listen. He spoke of a South Africa divided by law, of poverty enforced by design, of peaceful protest crushed again and again. He explained why resistance had evolved and why sabotage had been chosen over submission. And then he spoke words that would echo across generations. He said he had fought against white domination and he had fought against black domination. He said he cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons lived together in harmony and with equal opportunities. And then, calmly, he added, it was an ideal for which he was prepared to die. The courtroom fell silent. The judges withdrew. The world waited. Execution was expected. Instead, on June 12, 1964, the sentence was announced: life imprisonment. Mandela and his comrades were spared death, but condemned to disappear behind prison walls, far from public memory. As Mandela was led away, he did not shout, he did not protest. He walked with the stillness of someone who had already given everything. Outside the courtroom, hope flickered and dimmed. The ANC was crushed. Leaders were imprisoned or exiled. The apartheid state tightened its grip, believing it had won. But something unexpected happened. Mandela's words escaped the prison. They crossed borders. They reached classrooms, churches, and streets across the world. The man they had tried to silence became the clearest voice of all. As the prison gates closed behind him, Mandela stepped into a new role, one he had never sought. He became the conscience of a nation. The trial that was meant to end resistance had instead given it a face, a voice, and a moral center. And beyond the cold walls of his cell, the struggle continued, carried now by the strength of a man sentenced to a lifetime of silence.
Robben Island rose from the cold Atlantic like a place forgotten by time. Surrounded by icy water and relentless wind, it was meant to erase men, not rehabilitate them. When Nelson Mandela arrived there in 1964, he was given a number, not a name. Prisoner 466/64. The cell was small, bare, a thin mat on the floor, a bucket in the corner. Light entered only when the door opened. Silence pressed heavily, broken by the sound of waves crashing against stone. This was to be Mandela's world. Each day began before sunrise. Prisoners were marched to the limestone quarry, where the sun reflected harshly off white stone, damaging eyes and burning skin. The work was hard, pointless, and cruel by design. It was meant to break bodies and spirits. Mandela refused to break. He stood tall, even when beaten. He spoke calmly, even when insulted. He insisted on dignity, not as defiance, but as identity. The guards were young, poorly trained, and taught to hate. Some obeyed blindly. Others watched Mandela closely, unsure how to treat a man who refused to become small. Slowly, something changed. Mandela learned the power of patience. He studied the guards as carefully as he studied his comrades. He listened. He remembered names. He treated even cruelty with composure. Over time, respect replaced fear in unexpected places. Inside the prison, Mandela became a teacher. With books smuggled in and knowledge shared quietly, Robben Island turned into what prisoners called a university. Law, history, politics, and philosophy were debated in whispers and gestures. Mandela learned as much as he taught. But the pain of imprisonment was not only physical. Mandela was separated from his family. He missed his children growing up. Letters were censored or withheld. Visits were rare and brief, conducted through glass and silence. News from the outside arrived slowly and often too late. Years passed. The world changed. Apartheid hardened, then began to crack. Outside pressure grew. Inside the prison, Mandela aged but did not weaken. He began to understand that leadership in captivity meant restraint. Hot anger could destroy unity. Calm endurance could preserve it. When conflict arose among prisoners, Mandela mediated. When despair surfaced, he steadied it. Robben Island had failed to make him disappear. Instead, it transformed him. In confinement, Mandela refined the qualities that would later define him: patience, forgiveness, and unshakable self-control. He learned that hatred consumes the vessel that carries it, that dignity is a choice even when freedom is denied. As years turned into decades, the guards began to change too. Some asked questions, some listened, some quietly helped. The island had been designed to isolate Mandela from the nation, but slowly, impossibly, it was the nation that was moving toward him. Behind stone walls and steel doors, Nelson Mandela was preparing not for revenge, but for reconciliation. And the man the prison sought to break was becoming something far more powerful than it ever intended to create.
Time on Robben Island was measured not by clocks, but by stones, waves, and the slow drift of seasons. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, years that tested the limits of body, mind, and spirit. Days blended into nights, years into decades. Each sunrise brought the same routine: the march to the quarry, back to the cell, whispers of study and solidarity, silence punctuated only by the wind and the sea. For many, such a life would break them. For Mandela, it refined him. He learned patience as a weapon. He learned resilience as a companion. Every act of endurance, every measured word, every quiet conversation with a fellow prisoner became part of a larger strategy: survival not for himself, but for the hope of a nation. Letters from family were scarce, and visits were brief, often through glass with guards watching. Yet even when separated from his loved ones, Mandela nurtured connections in his mind. He imagined the children he rarely saw, the country beyond the walls, and the ideals for which he had dedicated his life. Inside the prison, Mandela became a mentor, teacher, and leader. Younger prisoners looked to him not only for guidance, but for example. His calm authority created order in chaos. Discussions about politics, law, and ethics became nightly rituals. Knowledge became a quiet rebellion, proof that their minds could never be caged. Outside, the world was changing. Pressure on South Africa grew. International movements began demanding the release of political prisoners. News trickled in through rare newspapers, smuggled letters, and whispers from visiting lawyers. The struggle for freedom continued without him, and yet he remained central to its heart. Through decades of monotony, harsh labor, and humiliation, Mandela honed an extraordinary strength: the ability to endure injustice without allowing it to corrupt his soul. He understood deeply that hatred is a chain and forgiveness is freedom. He wrote letters from his cell, carefully choosing words that could survive censorship. He studied law, politics, and languages. He debated strategy and morality. In isolation, he became more than a prisoner. He became a living symbol. The prison was meant to erase him. Instead, it amplified him. And while the years were long and often unbearable, they were preparing Mandela for the moment the world would finally see him, not as a man behind bars, but as a leader without fear. In silence, he found clarity. In captivity, he found purpose. In endurance, he found strength.
By the time the world began to demand his release, Nelson Mandela had transformed. He had become not only a man of remarkable courage, but a vessel for the hope of millions. And soon, the walls that had confined him for nearly 3 decades would crumble, not through force, but through the power of his unwavering spirit.
By the late 1970s, Nelson Mandela was no longer just a man behind bars. He had become a symbol, a living testament to the endurance of dignity and the inevitability of justice. Across the world, people spoke his name with reverence. In classrooms, newsrooms, and political assemblies, Nelson Mandela was more than an individual. It was the embodiment of resistance against oppression, hope against despair, and courage against fear. Inside Robben Island, Mandela remained prisoner 466-64. He still labored in the limestone quarries, still endured harsh conditions, still saw the world through the narrow confines of a cell. But outside, his story had escaped the walls. Artists painted his face, poets wrote his name, activists organized rallies demanding his release. International campaigns grew, flags flew in his honor, letters flooded the ANC leadership in exile. Mandela's silence became a voice louder than any shout. And yet, he never allowed the attention to soften him. He understood that fame without purpose is hollow. He remained disciplined, austere, and focused. He reminded younger prisoners that the struggle was larger than any one individual, that hope was not just for Nelson Mandela, but for every man, woman, and child denied freedom. Even small acts became powerful statements. He taught prisoners mathematics, history, and law. He mediated disputes among inmates. He maintained order when guards failed to do so. He insisted on respect for all, even the cruel, even the indifferent, because he knew that justice begins with the self. His health was tested by decades of hard labor, inadequate food, and harsh climate. Yet he remained upright, both physically and morally. Prisoners began to look to him not only as a leader, but as a moral compass, a man who could endure what most could not without losing his humanity. The apartheid regime tried to contain him, to reduce him to a number, a problem to be forgotten. But every attempt to erase him only strengthened his legend. Every harsh sentence, every denied visitor, every moment of isolation became part of the story the world told. Mandela's image appeared in newspapers, on posters, and in rallies from London to Tokyo. His resilience inspired not just South Africans, but countless others fighting oppression worldwide. Yet Mandela never sought the spotlight. He sought justice. He sought freedom. And through the longest imprisonment of his life, he learned that symbols are not born from speeches, but from quiet, consistent courage, lived every day in the face of adversity. By now, Mandela was more than a prisoner. He was a beacon, showing the world that one man's strength, grounded in principle and humanity, could illuminate the darkness of an entire nation. And even as decades passed, he never wavered in his belief that freedom could be achieved not through vengeance, but through dignity, patience, and moral courage. The walls of Robben Island had failed to contain him. They had not imprisoned hope. They had created it. On February 11th, 1990, the world held its breath. Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison, free at last after 27 years behind bars. The moment was quiet, yet monumental. He stepped into the sunlight with calm dignity, his face reflecting neither anger nor bitterness. Around him, crowds of supporters cheered, cameras clicked, and flags waved. But Mandela's gaze was steady, looking beyond the celebration toward the long road ahead. For decades, the world had waited for this day. For decades, he had waited in silence, endurance shaping him into a man ready for history. And now, freedom was not only personal,
It was national, a beacon of hope for a country battered by decades of division and cruelty. As Mandela emerged, he spoke not of revenge, but of reconciliation. He extended a hand to those who had oppressed him. He reminded South Africans and the world that true freedom is measured not only by who rules, but by how people treat one another. Immediately, Mandela returned to leadership. The African National Congress, still banned for years, now re-emerged as a legitimate force with Mandela at its helm. Negotiations with the government began, a delicate, tense, and unprecedented process aimed at dismantling apartheid without plunging the nation into civil war. Every step required patience. Every conversation demanded diplomacy. Mandela met with former adversaries, often facing anger, skepticism, and resentment. Yet he remained calm. He reminded everyone consistently that the future of South Africa depended on forgiveness, not vengeance. Outside the halls of power, Mandela inspired a new kind of hope. Crowds gathered wherever he appeared, not simply cheering, but learning a profound lesson in dignity, that leadership is rooted in courage, humility, and the willingness to put the greater good above personal satisfaction. The international community watched closely. Nations once silent under apartheid now supported reconciliation. Sanctions were lifted, dialogues opened, and Mandela became not only a South African leader, but a global symbol of peace and moral authority. Even in these early months of freedom, Mandela's focus was clear. He did not seek to punish, he did not seek to dominate, he sought to heal. He began advocating for a South Africa where all citizens, black, white, Indian, and colored, could live together in equality. He worked tirelessly to create frameworks for democracy, human rights, and social justice. The man who had endured decades of imprisonment now carried the weight of a nation's rebirth, and he carried it without bitterness, without haste, but with unyielding resolve. As Mandela walked free, South Africa itself seemed to take a deep breath. The walls of oppression were not yet gone, but the first steps toward unity had begun. In that moment, the prisoner had become a leader. The symbol had become a man of action, and history had begun to turn. Freedom had arrived, yet it was fragile. Nelson Mandela understood that walking out of prison was only the first step. True liberation required healing a nation torn apart by decades of hatred, fear, and division. And to do that, he had to do something almost unimaginable: sit down with those who had once imprisoned him. The apartheid leaders, including President F.W. de Klerk, represented everything Mandela had spent his life opposing. They were the architects of oppression, responsible for the laws that had controlled, humiliated, and imprisoned millions. Yet Mandela approached them not with anger, but with a clear-eyed strategy: dialogue over destruction. Negotiations were tense from the start. Meetings were filled with suspicion, old grudges, and veiled threats. Mandela knew that a single misstep could ignite violence across South Africa. One wrong word, one perceived insult, and years of struggle could be lost. But Mandela had learned the lessons of Robben Island. Patience, restraint, and understanding were more powerful than fury. He listened as much as he spoke, seeking common ground without sacrificing principles. He understood that a peaceful transition required trust, even when trust seemed impossible. Behind the scenes, Mandela worked tirelessly. He spoke with ANC leaders, urging compromise without surrender. He met with white South Africans, encouraging them to envision a future without fear. He reassured black South Africans that negotiations would not dilute justice, that equality would be preserved. The world watched closely. Violence threatened the country at every turn. Protests erupted. Extremists on both sides called for war. Yet Mandela remained calm. He reminded everyone, freedom achieved through bloodshed would never be true freedom. Months turned into years. Mandela and de Klerk exchanged ideas, proposals, and drafts. Meetings stretched late into the night. The negotiations were not simple, they were revolutionary. For the first time, South Africa was being reshaped not by force, but by conversation. In these moments, Mandela's leadership shone brightest. He understood that compromise was not weakness, forgiveness was not surrender. Courage was not only facing bullets, it was facing those who had once been enemies and treating them with dignity. The path to democracy was set, but danger lingered. Extremists threatened assassinations. Mass protests risked chaos. Mandela's calm, measured approach became a stabilizing force, reminding a fearful nation that reason could triumph over rage. Finally, after years of patient negotiation, the framework for South Africa's first fully democratic elections was established. Power would be shared temporarily to ensure a smooth transition, and all citizens, regardless of race, would have the right to vote. Mandela had achieved the impossible. He had taken a country on the brink of civil war and guided it toward a peaceful transformation. It was a victory not of arms, but of moral courage, vision, and relentless patience. And in the quiet moments after these historic agreements, Mandela remained humble. He did not boast of triumph, he did not celebrate personal glory. He understood that true leadership is measured not by victory over enemies, but by the ability to turn enemies into partners for the future. The prisoner, the symbol, the man of enduring silence had become the architect of a nation reborn. And South Africa, scarred yet resilient, was ready to follow him into a new dawn.
In 1994, Nelson Mandela stepped into history once more, not as a prisoner, not as a symbol, but as the first democratically elected president of South Africa. The nation he inherited was a land of deep scars. Decades of apartheid had left families divided, neighborhoods segregated, and mistrust ingrained in the hearts of millions. The economy was strained, violence lingered, and yet Mandela's first steps as president were not towards vengeance. He chose forgiveness. Mandela understood that justice without reconciliation would only perpetuate hatred. Punishing every perpetrator of apartheid could have plunged the country into chaos. Instead, he sought unity, offering a hand to those who had once ruled through oppression. One of his first acts as president was to invite former adversaries into positions of leadership. Members of the National Party, once the architects of apartheid, were asked to participate in government. Mandela believed that shared responsibility would prevent retaliation and build trust. He also championed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Here, victims of apartheid could tell their stories, and perpetrators could confess their crimes in exchange for amnesty. The process was painful, raw, and sometimes controversial, but it worked. It allowed the nation to confront its past without destroying its future. Mandela's approach was not soft, it was strategic courage. He understood that leadership was not about showing strength through domination, but through moral authority. By choosing forgiveness, he transformed fear into respect and suspicion into cooperation. Outside of politics, Mandela's presence inspired hope. He attended international events, met world leaders, and spoke of equality, peace, and human dignity. At home, he wore the rugby jersey of South Africa's national team, embracing a sport once associated only with white privilege, and in doing so, sent a powerful message of unity.
Mandela's presidency was also a lesson in personal humility. Despite global fame and immense power, he remained accessible, grounded, and connected to ordinary citizens. He greeted people warmly, listened to their concerns, and reminded the nation that leadership is service, not status. Under his guidance, South Africa began to heal. The economy slowly stabilized. Communities, once divided by fear, started cooperating. Children of all races began attending integrated schools, and for the first time in generations, South Africans could imagine a future defined not by oppression, but by possibility. Mandela knew that reconciliation was never easy. Some criticized his forgiveness, calling it naive, but he understood something profound. Anger left unchecked destroys both the victim and the oppressor. By choosing forgiveness, he preserved the soul of the nation and his own. As he looked out over a country he had fought for his entire life, Mandela saw hope emerging from the shadows of oppression. He had walked from village boy to prisoner, from symbol to president, and in every step he had carried one unshakable principle. Freedom without hatred is the only true freedom. The man who once stood alone under apartheid skies had transformed a nation, not with weapons, but with courage, patience, and the extraordinary power of forgiveness. And the world, watching in awe, learned that true greatness is measured not by triumph over others, but by the strength to uplift them.
Nelson Mandela's life was a journey measured not in years, but in courage, patience, and the choices he made when the world demanded hatred, but he offered forgiveness. After leaving the presidency in 1999, Mandela did not retreat into comfort or silence. Instead, he devoted himself to causes that transcended politics, education, health, human rights, and the fight against inequality. Even in retirement, he remained a global voice for justice, reminding the world that leadership is defined by service, not power. Mandela's personal life, once marked by hardship and sacrifice, became a testament to resilience. He navigated family challenges, celebrated the growth of his children and grandchildren, and carried the weight of the nation's hopes with quiet dignity. Yet his greatest gift to South Africa and the world was his example that freedom without hatred is possible. He had spent decades as a prisoner, yet he chose reconciliation over revenge. He had endured cruelty, injustice, and violence, yet he responded with empathy and moral clarity. The institutions he helped build, the laws he inspired, and the vision he embodied created a blueprint for justice that reached far beyond South Africa's borders. Nations once torn by conflict looked to Mandela for guidance. Leaders studied his strategy of dialogue. Citizens learned the transformative power of patience and forgiveness. Mandela's legacy is also deeply personal. It lives in the small acts of courage that individuals take every day, the willingness to speak truth, to stand against oppression, to lift others even when personal risk is high. He taught that change does not always roar. Sometimes it rises quietly, steadily, like waves shaping the shore. On December 5, 2013, the world mourned his passing. Yet Mandela had already achieved immortality, not in monuments, but in minds and hearts. The boy born under apartheid skies, the prisoner who endured decades, the president who chose forgiveness, his life became a living lesson that humanity is strongest when we rise above hatred and embrace dignity. Today, children learn his name, citizens invoke his principles, leaders study his approach, and everywhere people are reminded that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act rightly in its presence. Nelson Mandela's story is not just the story of a man, it is the story of a nation reborn and of a world that can hope for justice, compassion, and unity even in the darkest of times. His life asks a simple yet profound question of each of us. When faced with cruelty, will we choose vengeance or will we choose freedom without hatred? Mandela chose the latter, and because of that choice, the world is forever changed.